What do you do when you're working with an amazing web application that, for whatever reason, doesn't have an API? One option is to say, gee, I wish that site had an API and just give up. Or you could use Scrapy, an open source web scraping framework from Pablo Hoffman and ScrapingHub.com, and create your own API. On episode 50 of Talk Python to Me, we'll talk about how to do this, when it makes sense, and even when it's allowed. This episode has been recorded February 16th, 2016.
I'm a developer in many senses of the word, cause I make these applications, but I also use these verbs to make this music. I construct it line by line, just like when I'm coding another software design. In both cases, it's about design patterns. Anyone can get the job done, it's the execution that matters. I have many interests.
Welcome to Talk Python to Me, a weekly podcast on Python, the language, the libraries, the ecosystem, and the personalities. This is your host, Michael Kennedy. Follow me on Twitter where I'm at mkennedy. Keep up with the show and listen to past episodes at talkpython.fm and follow the show on Twitter via @talkpython. This episode is brought to you by Hired and SnapCI. Thank them for supporting the show on Twitter via @hired_HQ and @snap_CI. Hey everyone, thanks for joining me today. We have a great interview on tap with Pablo Hoffman. I want to give you a quick Kickstarter update before we get to that though. There are just 3 days left to join the course via Kickstarter and get a big discount while you're at it. Of course, it'll be for sale afterwards, but not at the Kickstarter prices. The students who have had early access have had really positive things to say. Here's just a taste. This is by far the best Python course I've done to date. Clear explanations, good apps that incorporate the concepts of particular sessions, and follow up on core concepts. The course is very engaging with a little humor, which makes it much easier to dedicate time to following along. If you're looking for an easy-to-follow, enjoyable Python course, back this project now, get comfortable, and enjoy. Thanks, Andy. You can check it out at talkpython.fm/course. Now, let's talk about web scraping. Pablo, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, we got some really cool stuff to talk about. Web scraping, open source businesses. We'll talk a little bit of Python 3, maybe. All sorts of cool things. But before we dig into them, let's talk about your story. How did you get into Python and programming?
All right, so I met Python when I was in college in 2004, and I immediately fell in love with it, with the simplicity and the structure of the syntax. Back then, I was doing a lot of subjects in college, but I always tried to find an opportunity to use Python for whatever. I will invent a lot of crazy, just useless stuff just to be able to use Python for it. Before Python, I used my past, like PHP, Perl. I don't regret anything I did. But I come from that background, more sysadmin, intranet web application background, sort of natural flow for me. I started working on Python in 2014, introduced by a colleague in college, and I never looked back. And it was only in 2007 that I was able to start a company working solely on Python. So I had to wait 3 years, but the time came.
But you've made it. You finally made it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm still here almost 10 years later working pretty much exclusively with Python and enjoying every moment of it.
Yeah, that's really cool. What continues to surprise me about Python is here's a language in an ecosystem that's 25 plus years old and seems to be becoming more popular and growing faster, even though it's not like something new that just sprung on the scene. So yeah, I think we're in a good place.
Yeah. I believe it's a lot of combination of things, right? And the community certainly is one of the key aspects of Python, in addition to the language being beautiful and elegant by itself. So a lot of things that come together for that to happen.
Yeah, I totally agree. So we're going to talk about web scraping. There's a whole variety of listeners. Some of them go, oh yeah, web scraping. I did that back in, whatever. But a lot of people maybe don't really understand or are familiar with this. So maybe give me the background on what is web scraping? Why do we do this? How's it work?
Right. So there's a bunch of information everywhere in the web right now, and has always been, and there continues to be, and will. The information is growing in unprecedented amounts, and so there's a natural need for extracting and using that information for all kinds of purposes. But you can't just take what's on a web page and use it as is. You need to transform it, extract it, and transform it in order to apply whatever business logic you need to apply to it. And that is where web scraping comes into play. And data is great. Data is beautiful. There's a lot of things that you can do with data once you have it in a format that you can manipulate. And so that's where web scraping discipline sits. And given the increasing and ever-increasing amount of data in web pages in a structured form, web scraping is here to stay definitely, and it's going to continue growing. My interest in web scraping came shortly after I met Python in college. So there was this news site ecosystem in my country, here in Uruguay, where newspapers had just came online but didn't really get it. So they posted the news there. However, they seemed too pleased, and the information there wasn't really accessible. There was no commenting possibilities. So I started off creating a news site that aggregated all the newspaper, the local media available then, which was really short, and sort of put it together in a single news aggregator with RSS feeds.
Nice. So was this like a very early simple version of Google News type thing?
Yeah, Google News existed back then, but Uruguay was completely ignored by them, right? Even up to today, we don't have Uruguay in Google News supported country. But you can think of it, as a Google News with custom structures for each site. So I ended up building this project. It was called NotiUI because of Noticias and Uruguay, the two words combined together. I built it in Python. The structures, the site was live, it started getting some attention. It was after that project that I ran on my extra time completely. It's a hobby project that I got noticed by a company here in Uruguay that introduced me to the company that I later joined to work full-time on Python. I eventually created Scrapy and open sourced it. So, yeah, it's funny how you can connect the dots after everything.
Yeah, you can connect the dots looking backwards, but not forwards, right?
Yeah, forward now.
That's really cool. Before we move on to Scrapy, ideally everything, all the information should be free. Maybe there should be like an HTTP JSON service we could access, or God forbid, like an XML SOAP WCF service or something. But a lot of times, even that is not available, right? It's on the web, and technically you can get the text, but nobody's built an API, right? And that's really where web scraping kind of comes in, is when you know the data is accessible, but there's no structured API for it, right?
Exactly. And as a future of web scraping, I see scraping evolving a lot with a lot more machine learning incorporated directly at the early extraction phase, so that you can turn website page into an API as quick as possible without requiring manual coding or manual intervention.
That's really interesting, because the web scraping that I know is you say, I'm looking for this information, and maybe here's a CSS selector that I could go against the page, and then I'll grab it. But that's not machine learning, right?
That's the web scraping that most people is familiar with. But once you need to scale to a lot of websites, that simply doesn't work. It was the scraping that Scrapy was built for. And because of this need to scale to maintaining a lot of website structures in a common way and a more consistent, unified fashion, is that the Scrapy idea came to light. Because otherwise, after you're maintaining a couple dozen sites, you're fighting with just your own code infrastructure rather than writing the XPath or the CSS selectors. That's the easy part, right? That's one of the big reasons why we came up with Scrapy.
Very cool. So why don't you tell us what it is?
Scrapy started as an initiative to build a lot of web scrapers more easily and relieve the pain of maintaining them. Because Scrapy was built in an environment where we had to maintain hundreds of spiders, as we call them. And you need to have a certain structure in the code, certain conventions in place, so that when someone else joins the team, a new developer joins the team and starts developing new spiders, they don't need to go through learning a lot of intricate internals about how the spiders are supposed to work and the rest of the infrastructure. So what Scrapy does is it tries to factor out the common things that you do when you write web scrapers and separate them from the actual extraction rules or XPath and CSS selectors that you will type for each website, so that you have all the rest as given. You can focus just on what needs to vary per site. So that's where Scrapy excels, really. And compared to like other ad hoc solutions, like combining requests with Beautiful Soup, which are great libraries and they do a great job. And maybe if you're writing a single structure for a single site, you wouldn't find much difference between using one or the other. But if your project involves maintaining a spider for hundreds or even dozens of websites, you'll see these conventions that Scrapy proposes as very welcome advantages. So in a way, like, it's a framework. It's not a library. So it's not that it doesn't get in the way. It does get in the way, but for good reasons. It tries to impose some common practice and good practices and mechanisms so that you don't have to go through the typical journey of first doing this simple stuff and then realizing that you needed something more complex, only to end up implementing a smaller version of what Scrapy is.
That's a really interesting comparison with the other ones. I want to have you maybe quickly walk people through the API, but before we kind of get off the beginning of it, can you just tell me the history? You said it came out of your work at this company. Like, did you actually get permission to kind of extract that framework out, or did you leave that company and rebuild it with your knowledge from there? What year is that?
This company, Mydeco, was a furniture aggregator in the UK. I joined them in 2007. And when I joined Mydeco, there was a lot of parts of Scrapy already built there, like the core framework, the downloader, and the more important internals were already in place. It was working fine already. You really noticed that there was an improvement over how you will go about writing ad hoc web crawlers. So I started in this scraping department in Mydeco, and I noticed that there was a huge potential for releasing this to the wild and making other people benefit from it. By then, I was already a hardcore open source fan, and I've been following many open source projects and open source practices, and I was looking for an opportunity to get involved and to release my own open source project. Pretty much like I was waiting for opportunities to pop up on where to work on Python in 2004. I was looking for open source opportunities in 2007 as well. Yeah, fortunately, the people in charge of Mydeco, of the technical part of Mydeco, were quite aligned with open source as well, quite fans themselves. So that makes things a lot easier. So we didn't have much problems convincing the board, or they didn't have much problems convincing the board to allow us to open source that part. What happened afterwards is that there was a lot of work on my side, and a couple of guys that worked in my company back then, working on ironing out, factoring out the common code and packaging it in a way that makes sense for external developers to digest and use.
That's cool. And when you did that, basically you released this open source. Did this company like take it back and sort of start using it, or did they just kind of go along in a parallel path?
We started from something already built, right? It's not like we decided to build an open source project and started from scratch there. We had a system already working, and we wanted to take certain core parts of it and open source it. This was a challenge because there was a lot of dependencies in the code that took us some time to factor out. But at no point we wanted to diverge or fork into two separate projects. I never even considered it to go that path, but I think it was crucial and important that we remain always in sync, because Mydeco was the main user of Scrapy, and the feedback loop was crucial for Scrapy to succeed. If you look at it, like, it makes no sense to build an open. At least if you want to build a successful open source project, for me, you need to have successful companies or users using it, right? Just don't build it in abstract unless it's an academic thing, of course. This allows us to grow Scrapy. The beginning was a lot of the integration work, to put it somehow, so that all the crawlers at this company remain running while we move stuff to a state where it could be open source. And sure, a few spiders broke here and there, but we learn along the process how to improve spider testing, if you will, for when you make changes in a framework, and that's also part of Scrapy as one of the features.
One thing that's cool about the spiders is you can rerun them against the same source if you have to, right?
You can check if they extract the same data, and that's how you actually check that the spiders remain working. You need to find a way to do it fast enough if you have thousands of them. That's just one caveat to keep in mind. But
Sure. What was the version of Python that you started on?
It was 2.5 back then. It was only year or two ago that we dropped support for 2.5 in Scrapy. And yeah, right now we're 2.7 and almost finishing support for Python 3. Actually, support is finished and it's in beta mode now in the last version of Scrapy, which makes me very proud.
Yeah, I just saw an announcement, like, what was that, 2 weeks ago, that you guys announced that you are now officially beta in Python 3. I had a project where I needed to do some web scraping, and I ended up going the Request Plus Beautiful Soup 4 direction because I didn't want to be painted into the corner of having to do Python 2. And I'm like, oh, if I go down Scrapy, the path, maybe. But so I was like, oh, yes, that's great when that came out. So congratulations. Was it a lot of work?
It was, because it's a moderately big project. But we decided to really, really prioritize this because we realized that maybe a bit late, if you will, that people were actually not using or leaving Scrapy because of the lack of Python 3 support. But I'm glad that we're on it now and we have it there. And
yeah, that's fantastic. Congrats.
Thank you.
Cool. So let's talk about the API a little bit. If you go to scrapy.org, right there you've got like a couple of code snippets showing you how you can use it and so on. One of your examples is if I go to like a blog, I want to go grab all the links that are categories. Can you maybe just talk us through what that looks like?
Yeah. You want me to go through the of the code that is on the Scrapy.org? Or?
Not exactly. Just tell me what, like, kind of, how do I get started with Scrapy?
Yeah.
Basically.
So Scrapy has a pretty good tutorial in the base documentation that I recommend as a starting point. I always recommend a starting point. The idea is that you should, unless you have complex needs, you should be enough writing a spider, which can be just a couple of lines as it's shown in Scrapy.org website. The spider API itself is really simple in the sense that you have this, class to group all things related to the spider, and the class has methods that are called. These are essentially callbacks that are called with responses or web pages that are retrieved from the web that are delivered to these callbacks. And then these callbacks process the response in however they need, and then return items or subsequent requests to follow. That's the very basic idea of Scrapy API in its best. So using this simple API, you can build a lot of things on top of it. I love APIs that are really simple at the bottom and that allows you to do a lot. This is the most basic spider API, and all spiders in Scrapy will follow this one. But then on top of it, there's variations and improvements like something called crawl spider that will allow you to set up some rules for URLs that should be followed by the spider. So you set up some class attributes with these rules and the start URLs that they should start crawling from. And the spider automatically follows them and calls certain callbacks when the URLs fit a certain pattern. This type of spider is very useful for example, crawling a retailer, an e-commerce site where you want to extract product data for certain URLs. And many sites will follow this pattern of having a certain pattern of URLs to follow and certain rules to extract the product data out of the pages. So all that internally is built with the simple API of receiving a response and returning requests to follow and items of escape data. That's basically one of the great things and beauty of it.
That's really cool. And at the heart of it, you've got this CSS method that I can give sort of complex hierarchical CSS expressions to get a hold of the pieces I need, right?
Yeah, and then on the extraction side, we also provide some convenient methods for extracting the data using well-known selectors like CSS selectors or even XPaths. Yeah, this is the most universal way to address regions of pages, so you can do anything with it. And with the request to follow, you can generate further requests to make what you would say AJAX calls in order to retrieve extra data from the web pages. And here is something to know. If you want to use this low level, you need to view in your browser what requests the website is doing and replicate those in Scrapy.
Oh, interesting. So suppose I want to go and I want to scrape like a single page app, spa type app that's written in AngularJS, right? If I just go hit that with a direct request, I'm going to get curly this, curly that, meaningless, no data, right?
Yeah, exactly.
This episode is brought to you by Hired. Hired is a two-sided curated marketplace that connects the world's knowledge workers to the best opportunities. Each offer you receive has salary and equity presented right up front, and you can view the offers to accept or reject them before you even talk to the company. Typically, candidates receive 5 or more offers within the first week, and there are no obligations, ever. Sounds awesome, doesn't it? Well, did I mention the signing bonus? Everyone who accepts a job from Hired gets a $1,000 signing bonus. And as Talk Python listeners, it gets way sweeter. Use the link hired.com/talkpython to me, and Hired will double the signing bonus to $2,000. Opportunities knocking. Visit hired.com/talkpython to me and answer the call.
Remember that Scrapy was built in a different world in 2007. There was a lot of static.
There was not so much Ajax, not so much JavaScript.
And now with this crazy world moving to more like apps running in websites rather than websites, Scrapy still is able to do it because Scrapy is to some extent a very low level. Whatever you can do in a browser, you can do in Scrapy because it works at the HTTP response request level. You sometimes feel that you need to something like more digestible so that you have the data readily available, or the data that is delivered to Scrapy. Based on this need, we're working on extending Scrapy JavaScript support and being the hardcore reusable component fans that we are, we ended up creating a separate component called Splash, which is sort of a mini browser that runs with an HTTP API and interacts really well with Scrapy. It's one of the many libraries that integrates well with Scrapy, and so that you can actually have rendered data, JavaScript rendered data available in your callbacks for it to use, as well as executing actions on the website.
That's really cool. I didn't know it did that, so that's really excellent.
Yeah, it's not one of the things that are most prominently shown in when you came across Scrapy.
Yeah, of course. But if you've got to go after a website that's sort of one of these front-end JavaScript data binding type frameworks, you have to have those things. That's really cool. So another thing that's in your sample that I think is worth bringing up just really quickly, although it's not specific to what you guys are doing, is you're using the yield keyword and your parse methods, and the bit that you do supports sort of these generator methods.
Yeah.
And these sort of progressive, get as much as you like type of methods. So do you want to maybe just talk really quickly about generator methods? Because I don't think we've talked about it on the show very often, if at all.
Yeah, absolutely. So this spider callbacks that I was talking about actually can return a generator or an iterator in its most general form. So what Scrapy does internally, it calls this callback and starts iterating the output of it. So it can potentially return an infinite generator. And Scrapy sometimes is used that way. You start in a page and start monitoring the page and keep returning data and your requests to follow as they appear. Or you generate just incremental numbers or whatever of pages to check. And yeah, the Scrapy uses memory efficiently in order not to consume the whole generator at once. It consumes it in sizable, manageable parts, and it has a bunch of flow control directives in place to make sure that no place in the framework consumes too much and overflows memory. This has the result that in the spider code you can use nice things like yield, where you just send the data out into Scrapy framework side, and you'll be sure that it's going to get processed, and you don't have to check yourself that if you're sending too much data or too little or whatever. So yeah, that's how you can make benefits of how Scrapy makes benefit.
Yeah, so internally it uses iterators everywhere, and you can just layer on your own iterators, right? Because if it would build like lists and, fill them up, that would kind of be useless, right?
Exactly. It's iterator and generator friendly by default, and you can take that advantage.
Yeah, that's really awesome. If I want to go to a website, maybe let's just take somewhere like the New York Times, say. So the New York Times, they're a well-known newspaper. Their articles are highly valued, but there's also usage restrictions. They have their so-called paywall about trying to make sure you have an account and stuff. Is it legal for me to go and turn Scrapy loose on the New York Times? Or what's the story sort of around like when I can and can't use the web scraping?
We like to see scraping as a tool. And as with many other tools, you can use it for with legal purposes in mind and illegal purposes in mind. Even tools like BitTorrent, which is the de facto example, can be used for completely authentic and genuine stuff, legal stuff. I'm not saying that. So the use, what you're doing with the tool is ultimately what makes it illegal or not. In the case of the New York Times, you should probably obey whatever rules they have to access the content, and hope that sometimes they will realize that they are doing it wrong. You can't see, at least I don't see scraping as a way to get data, to steal data that isn't supposed to be taken. Like, there's a lot of projects and stuff out there that uses scraping to just gather the data that is already available there, and in order to process it.
Right, like a really common example would be Google.
Exactly.
I don't know that they use Scrapy, but obviously they do that. Conceptually, they do that, right?
Exactly. Google is the largest scraper in the world, and they get the data and add value to it by showing them in their search results. Similar thing applies everywhere for us and how we tackle projects. We generally go with public information only when we work on scraping projects. We don't want to deal with all the legal stuff like this. And we always recommend customers to get proper assistance and, if possible, consent from the websites to get the data. Because many cases, believe it or not, the websites don't care if you take the data from them, but they just don't want to go through the trouble of packaging the data and sending it to you or putting it from.
Yeah, right. Or maybe they would like to, but they're technically incapable.
Exactly.
Not everybody who has a website is a programmer.
Yeah, I've heard so many times saying to website owners saying, okay, if you can take the data and you don't cause me any problems, then go for it. And you wouldn't believe how common that sentiment is.
Yeah, that's really cool. Let's talk about large-scale web crawling. I mentioned Google. That's kind of large-scale. You had your experience with thousands of crawlers. What do you need to worry about when you're running stuff at that scale rather than I have like my app that goes to one page and just gets some information?
Right. Scraping can kind of scale in two directions, I would say. One is the code direction, and another is the infrastructure and volumes direction. Large scale at the code side could be like having to maintain a couple of thousand spiders in your project. Let's call it like more vertical scaling, if you will. Whereas scaling in the horizontal or infrastructure side will be having a single code, perhaps more automated or based on sophisticated extraction that needs to grow like a lot of web pages, like hundreds of millions of web pages.
Okay, and that's more like what you're talking about with the machine learning. Like maybe you would do Scrapy plus scikit-learn and a single code base to just go understand the web versus I know that these are the 27 retailers' websites and I want to like give you the price of all of them. So I'll write specific code to get the price of these common objects, something like this, right?
Yeah, exactly. And you can only scale so much, vertically scale so much with numbers of spiders because the cost starts increasing quite a lot to keep these spiders running and well maintained. So because spiders break, you need to monitor them, react when they break, and the size of the team that you need to have to maintain it goes up really quick.
You get a little nice happy message from Target saying, we've just redesigned Target.com, and you're like, oh no, there it goes, right?
Don't get me started with Black Friday and holiday seasons. Challenges vary depending on which case we're talking. The code scalability is somehow minimized or addressed as much as possible by Scrapy common conventions. It's as much as you can do. I mean, in the end, you have to write the XPath or CSS selectors anyway at some point. But aside from that, anything else that can be automated, infrastructure or review side, we try to automate it. The other type of scalability problems are related with crawling a huge number of pages. There involves not only the massive amount of data that you need to go through and to digest, but things like revisiting policies for when you have to keep track of a huge number of pages in a very large website or group of websites, and you only want to revisit them depending on how often they get updated. So there's a few common algorithms used in this case, but the big challenge here is keeping this big queue of URLs that you need to keep control of and prioritize, because the crawler just kind of takes URLs from a queue. Curly just will ask a queue, okay, what's the next URL you want me to fetch? And it will take that URL, fetch it, return the process results. But keeping this queue is the challenging thing when doing it at scale.
Yeah, of course, because you want to, cache, like sort of conceptually cache as much of that as possible, not hit it if it's not going to have changed. Is that a place where you could plug in like machine learning and have it watch and sort of tell it like, this time I learned something new, this time I didn't, and it could maybe be smart about this?
Yeah, exactly. As I was saying, there's a few common algorithms used to revisit simply based on frequency. For example, frequency of updates. Like if you visit a page 2 times and during a certain amount of period and the page is the same, or actually the extracted data is the same.
Exactly. That's what matters, right?
Just to take out overhead changes. Then you perhaps double the time that you're going to check that page again. So if you be revisiting a day, it didn't change, then you're going to visit again at least in 2 days from now. And if the page changed, then for that page, you reduce to the half of the time that you waited. So you're going to revisit it in half day and let the wait times adjust automatically. That works as a basic algorithm, works really well. And Scrapy has its own internal scheduler, which serves as this in-memory queue for requests. It can only grow so much because Scrapy all runs in a process, in an operating system process, and there's memory limitations when running a single process. So when you need to scale to very large number of web pages, you need to use something external. And on this side of the equation is that we're working for just over a year now in a new project called Frontera, which is an extension to Scrapy to deal with large crawls. And it essentially manages what is called the crawl frontier. I should have mentioned before, but this queue of requests to follow is called the crawl frontier in scraping and web crawling terms.
Yeah, very cool. You guys also built like a web crawling as a service, or web crawling infrastructure as a service, if you will, right? Tell me about that.
Yeah, so one of the things that are common to many scraping, if not all scraping projects, are the infrastructures required by it. As I was saying, writing the CSS selector XPath is something that you may need to do separately for each website. But all the rest, like running the spider, getting the data, reviewing the data with your colleagues or customer, iterating over it, it's pretty much the same. And it's surprisingly what ends up taking more time than writing the CSS selectors or the XPath itself. Because when you're dealing with data, sometimes there are different expectations of how the customers needs the data and how you produce it from your spider. So being able to have those in sync with an efficient tool is of crucial importance. So we realized this around 2010 that there was a business opportunity to launch a tool for taking the next step after Scrapy, because Scrapy kind of solves the problems at the developer level. You can run a Scrapy spider with the Scrapy crawl command. It all works the same in any machine, in any platform. But what after that? What if you need to collaborate with teams? Then it starts getting a bit complicated. We started ScrapingHub to deal with that, with running Scrapy spiders in the cloud in the most friendly way possible, so that developers can benefit from.
Yeah, that's cool. And that's just at scrapinghub.com, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so people can check it out there. Maybe tell us, like, what is the main use case? Like, why do people come and set up a system to run on your platform?
The nice thing about ScrapingHub is that you can run any Scrapy spider that runs in your machine already will run on ScrapingHub Cloud. So that's the premise of the service. We don't require you to make any changes to your already working spiders. You can just run a command, ScrapingHub deploy, and you have it already deployed in our cloud, and you can run it using the web analytics panel from there. Think of it similar to Heroku here. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but Heroku is the same for websites. You have a website running locally, and yes, you need to configure some manifest file for sure to indicate a few things, but that's all you need to do. And then with the Heroku deploy, you have the website running. It doesn't matter where you have the URL. and anyone can access it. We wanted to build the same for spiders. There wasn't anything like it, and still there isn't. And we realized that we had kind of this the best framework for writing web spiders, and kind of the next obvious thing to do was to give it a the friendliest way possible to run this and collaborate with your team. You can run and you can see the data that is being scraped with the images or all those things like nicely rendered, and you can add inline comments to the data to check and mention colleagues to check if it's okay. The other big piece of infrastructure is that it's very hard to have this infrastructure when you're small. So it doesn't make sense to build this if you're just crawling a few sites. Although big companies that do a lot of web crawling like Google have their own sophisticated crawling infrastructures already in place. And having a sophisticated crawling infrastructure in place is a pretty daunting task for a small startup or for a small company. So we wanted to make that accessible for small companies when we started ScrapingHub. All this, or as much as this nice infrastructure perks that one has when you have a recently large crawling infrastructure, and make it available to everyone.
That's really an interesting mission. I mean, if I was going to do a startup and a key component of that was to go out and just gather all this data through web scraping, you could set up your own infrastructure on AWS or DigitalOcean or wherever, right? But that's not your job. Why do you want to do that, right? Just drop it over there and let you guys deal with it. Continuous delivery isn't just a buzzword. It's a shift in productivity that will help your whole team become more efficient. With SnapCI's continuous delivery tool, you can test, debug, and deploy your code quickly and reliably. Get your product in the hands of your users faster and deploy from just about anywhere at any time. And did you know that ThoughtWorks literally wrote the book on continuous integration and continuous delivery? Connect Snap to your GitHub repo and they'll build and run your first pipeline automagically. Thanks SnapCI for sponsoring this episode by trying them for free at snap.ci/talkpython.
That's what we try to convey. Like we are the Heroku we're trying to become the Heroku of web scraping. You can always build an AWS server or DigitalOcean server and deploy everything there, and it will work because everything is based on open source tools, and we have remained firmly against any type of vendor lock-in. We release as much as we can on open source, and I'm not understating this in any way. The things that we haven't yet open source if because we haven't cleaned them enough to send them out there, and it will cause more harm than good being out there. But eventually we see ourselves like open sourcing everything and charging for infrastructure essentially to run those things. We don't want to charge for code licenses or...
Right. Do you see it as somewhat analogous to OpenStack?
Yes, absolutely.
From a business model.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because the infrastructure is something that you can never expect to open source, right? So it's not like a major flaw that we could have at some point. And so, yeah, it's very similar in that regard to OpenStack. There's also two types of customers, right? As sometimes I say, like developers with no money, but very, very eager to learn and do stuff, and companies with big pockets and no time, and they want things like working tomorrow. We're trying to fulfill both targets, right? We have a business division in ScrapingHub where you can get the spider written and everything, and you don't need to do anything, just get the data. But internally, this uses all of the rest of our platform that we share with developers in the world, and we both work on the platform. So if you're a developer, you can use the platform, and if you're a business, you can hire developers to using the same platform, get the job done for you. And I believe that trying to fulfill both audiences is key for business built around open source to succeed. Well, I guess you could extend that to any business, but it has been one of our best decisions. And I've always been a fan of building developer tools, like coming from a developer background, and I'm still programmer first and foremost. I love tools that are well done, that allow you to enjoy working and like having fun while you work. So I love building these things. I always, like, when I wanted to work on something, I first tried to build tools to make that something more efficient before actually going to work.
Yeah, that's cool. And now you just get to enable other people to build their thing, right? And you get to just keep working on the tools.
Yeah.
So I want to come back to this idea of open source and business. These are very interesting mixes to me. Real quickly, what's the future of web scraping? Like, from where we are now, what do you see coming up in the next 5 or 10 years that's going to be different?
Well, the web is going to be there still, that's for sure. Technologies will change quite a bit in 5 years if you look back at what happened in the last 5 years. And I think the world is a lot less proprietary now in terms of internet technologies. Perhaps the last big one was the fact that Flash lost to HTML5. It's a kind of the last example of a big proprietary versus open technology.
Yeah, that's a big technical wall coming crashing down that like will let you into that area now, right?
Yeah. So, of course, we benefit from the fact that everything is in HTML. It's going to be more in HTML out there. And it will continue to be. But the point is that technologies may change a bit, but the information that is available out there will need to be retrieved and used by companies. So scraping in general, I don't think that it will change much the concept. The earlier concept of screen scraping, of extracting data from screens rather than from web pages, still remains to this day. And if anything, scraping, it will change like a bit in terms of how you extract the data, and it's going to involve a lot more JavaScript processing and kind of tool automation for reproducing actions rather than following links to follow the pattern of how web applications are transforming. But I don't expect like a lot of that to change aside from that, really. But there's going to be a lot of sophisticated technologies that will keep increasing on the side of keeping web crawlers away, detecting web crawlers and banning them for sure.
There's a bit of an arms race there, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's
user agent equals MSIE 10.
Yeah,
things like this. Yes,
that summarizes it well. But the fact that the companies are going to be more protective of their data, or some of them, the ones that consider it a core business value, will mean that the scraping technologies will need to evolve and become more sophisticated as well to follow it. So there's going to be a large, very expensive private market where you will be able to find, I don't know, mechanisms to still get the data out of web pages with a even bigger infrastructure. Yeah. But that's not like the focus of what we're trying to achieve, right?
Right, of course. So two other things that sort of not knowing anything about this come to mind for me is one, you talked about the JavaScript front-end stuff, the fact that you guys support grabbing sort of AngularJS style apps. I think there's more of those, right? So that'll be interesting. But what about HTTP 2? Will that have any effect on you guys, or better scalability, or no effect? What do you think?
No, I don't see HTTP. I mean, it won't change really much. Like it's going to be part of the framework will be adapted to take HTTP 2 enhancement in hand, but the discipline of scraping data, I don't see it will change much after that.
Yeah,
WebSockets may require, if you think of it as a different approach to it.
Yeah, when the data starts coming out of WebSockets.
Yeah, I guess that we haven't done pretty much any WebSockets scraping recently or at all, and really haven't put a lot of thought to it. It hasn't crossed my mind a lot lately.
Sure. So let's talk a little bit about, while we have a few minutes left, let's talk about business, open source, making a living on open source. There's some really powerful examples of companies doing this and people doing it, but there's also a lot of people who dream of it but don't see a path forward. right? Notable examples of people making it work are companies Continuum, the Anaconda guys, the Red Hat and OpenStack, MongoDB. Like those are all really companies that have somehow made open source work.
Somehow made it work.
Somehow, but there's got to be a ton of like failed attempts, unfortunately. So maybe tell me how is it going for you guys? What's it like to run sort of a distributed company that builds an open source product, but still, somehow makes it a business?
We started by doing a lot of professional, and we still do a lot of professional service work consulting using our own tools. So you need to keep this in mind, this audience of companies and businesses that could benefit from your open source project if you want to make a living out of it. In our case, it wasn't too difficult, right? Because there's a natural need from data. Data is king, and many companies are after data. And the open source tool that we developed and we maintain is related to extracting data. So we started ScrapingHub with no external funding and still don't have any, by providing solutions to these companies first and foremost. And then we will evolve the open source product as the needs of our customers require, improving it along the way when we found the opportunity. And even up to this point, the modus operandi is very similar. The platform and the other service that I mentioned were grown out of need from our customers. So try to find, I would say in a general advice, try to find where your paying customers will be, like companies that will benefit from your open source project, and try to build a company that provides these offerings. In our case, we did it by providing development expertise to write web crawlers, but it's very similar how we did it with how Continuous does it, for example. And I'm a big fan of them, and it's a really nice model to follow. They do a lot of consulting, but they keep this Anaconda platform and everything that makes their jobs easier and at the same time allows them to spend working on open source a lot. And I always wanted to be able to just live in the open source world and keep coding on Scrapy. Unfortunately, I'm not able to code much on Scrapy these days, but I plan to return to it once the the company runs in autopilot and I'm able to retire to get back to Scrapy and size projects. But yeah, if you just try to connect the dots to where companies will make use of the open source project that you're working on. Like if you're working on something like Bootstrap, found a consulting company that builds websites quickly, prototype websites quickly, those type of things.
So let me think through, if I were trying to plan this out for Scrapy, how it might go. So if I were, you guys 5 or 8 years ago, before you started ScrapingHub, I'm thinking, okay, well, I've got this really successful web scraping open source project and people are using it, the company's using it, they're using it as a tool, but the thing they actually want is they want lots of data off web pages fast. And so then how do you build a business? I think it makes perfect sense to say, well, let's build like this infrastructure where you can take the thing you're already doing and just push a button, drop it onto it, and deliver the data fast in a reliable way without all the other stuff, right? Without adding anything to it.
Yeah.
Is that kind of the thinking you guys went through? Or?
That's a perfect example. And in fact, we didn't focus early on just pushing a button and getting the data automatically. We focused more on the provides engineer hours and consulting and training for our tools, but we are very much focused on data marketplaces and automatic APIs to do extraction right now. But the model is just what you just described is also perfectly possible. I mean, it's a way to go about doing that, and it's even better if you find a way to productize your open source project in a way that companies can be able to benefit from it without having to go through all the installation and configuration and customization phase. So if you find a way to productize your open source project and provide it in a hosted manner, is another very common example of a few successful ones, like GetSentry, for example, this tool for monitoring websites. They provide a nice hosted solution of the open source tool, and they're doing awesome. Yeah, that's another model that works really well. It's in the end a matter of finding where your tool produces value to business and try to sort of connect the dots or try to offer it so that when you're working for your customer, you're implicitly forced to work on your open source project and remain connected to it and growing it. You need to find a way to put your open source project in your work agenda. So that is not something that you do in your extra time or as a hobby.
Right. So if you do consulting, maybe you make sure that your contracts include clauses that if I'm helping you with consulting using my open source project, and there's a natural enhancement that I could add to the project, but that would be kind of driven by your need, make that possible for me to put that in my open source project without any conflict, something like that, right?
Exactly. In our cases, we include a clause like that. Sometimes we even get and Scrapy enhancements sponsored by our customers, which is great. Can get that a win-win situation. You need to be a bit creative, of course, and be patient as well. Like for a long time, at the early stages of Scrapy, I was working on it on my extra time, and I wasn't really sure where the project was going or if it was going to be successful at all. But I just wanted to build something. That was my main motivation back then. Like create something of value to developers, because I was a developer full-time back then, and something that made my show a little more fun. And that's what I did. And then it was later than I realized I had a nice thing going on, a nice open source project that the community has gathered around. First, it was just a couple of guys, and I tried to help them and answer a few questions and here and there. And yeah, there was this community that encouraged me to quit my show and focus solely on Scrapy.
Was that a pretty happy day?
Yeah, at the time it was a bit a bit crazy, like leaving my show and just starting this. But to be honest, I already had a few customers like that were going to become immediate ScrapingHub customers. So it was enough to sustain a small business, because we kind of had the market proven before I started ScrapingHub. I know there's you can do even a lot more risky moves, but I constantly feel proud about the things that Scrapy has achieved. And a lot of things that are achieved lately are not thanks to me. Like I'm not super involved day to day in the project itself. But it's like when you see your kid, right, that just when graduated from college and is doing great things out there, it really makes me very proud. And just last month, the first Scrapy book came live, and that was a really happy thing for me when I realized.
I'm sure you're really proud of it. That's great. Congratulations. So the companies I named earlier, possibly with the exception of Continuum, were really large companies. But you're not a super large company, right? How many people work with you?
At the moment, we are 130 people working fully distributed around the world, which to me is pretty big, but of course not compared.
Okay, that's bigger than I realized. That's awesome. Yeah, cool.
So yeah, we were kind of growing and doubling in size every year, more or less. Like we never kind of set a goal of like let's double in size or let's grow to this size. It kind of just naturally happened. Like customers were requesting more work, and we keep adding people to the team as there was more work. And now we have a large part of the team working on the platform that already drives a lot of demand. And running a remote company comes with its challenges, right? I mean, you have a lot of time zone issues, coordination between teams, like communication is key, self-management is very important. But in exchange, you have a global pool of talent available to you. And that's been one of the key, if not possibly the most important thing to be able to grow ScrapingHub to the size that we've grown it so far. Like we've been focusing really hard on hiring the best talent out there. It took us a while, but I'm really proud of the team that we have assembled, and I'm sure that the best is still to come. I've always kind of worked remotely since I started working professionally in 2000, because I was sort of a sysadmin at the beginning. So yeah, I managed the servers from home. Then I worked for this company in the UK that built this aggregator, and I was also remote there, and kind of felt natural to continue working this way for me, and also the things that I learned while managing the Scrapy community, I try to apply them as much as possible to manage the ScrapingHub as well. Like the whole culture of not asking for, it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission, those type of things, I really apply to ScrapingHub. Sometimes I try to see it as a really big open source project with some commercial interest that we're trying to manage.
Yeah, you must be super proud of what you built. That's awesome. And I think people will really enjoy hearing this sort of success story from the beginning till now. That's great. So we just have like a couple minutes for final questions. Questions I always say at the end of the show. If you're going to write some Python code, what editor do you open?
Well, I'm a Vim guy. What can I say?
All right, awesome. That may be the most common answer. I think it probably is.
I'm quite fond of Sublime.
Yeah.
Because I'm not writing much code these days. I've tried Sublime a couple of times, and it's the first one that made me consider leaving Vim aside. But
yeah, it hasn't pulled you over to its side yet.
No, not yet.
All right, and from all the packages on PyPI, there's 70-something thousand these days. There's so many that are awesome that maybe people don't know about. Like, what would you recommend? Like, obviously, pip install Scrapy, and then anything else?
There's a whole bunch of interesting stuff there. It's hard to name, to pick one. I'll just try to think one that is not part of a Scrapy ecosystem. Do definitely give a try to Sentry if you're running a website. It's really cool stuff to monitor websites.
Okay, yeah, Sentry's nice.
Yeah, that's. I guess I will go with that one.
Go with Sentry. Awesome. Okay, before we let you go, any final calls to action? Things people should go try?
Yeah, definitely. Come try ScrapingHub, and you won't regret. If you have any scraping needs at any level, like we are building the most awesome tools to make your job easier. So yeah, I'm always happy to get in calls with people doing things related with scraping, and would like to learn more about what your needs are and how we can make your life easier.
Awesome. So everyone check it out. Pablo, it's been really fun to talk about web scraping. I've learned a ton from it.
Thank you. Likewise, it's been a very interesting job.
Yeah, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, bye. This has been another episode of Talk Python to Me. Today's guest was Pablo Hoffman, and this episode has been sponsored by Hired and SnapCI. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Hired wants to help you find your next big thing. Visit hired.com/talkpython to me to get 5 or more offers with salary and equity presented right up front, and a special listener signing bonus of $2,000. SnapCI is modern, continuous integration and delivery. Build, test, and deploy your code directly from GitHub, all in your browser with debugging, Docker, and parallelism included. Try them for free at snap.ci/talkpython. It's the final few days for my video course Kickstarter. The campaign is open until March 18th, and you'll find all the details at talkpython.fm/course. Hurry on over there and sign up before it closes. You can find the links from today's show at talkpython.fm/episode/show/50. Be sure to subscribe to the show. Open your favorite podcatcher and search for Python. We should be right near the top. You can also find the iTunes and direct RSS feeds in the footer of the website. Our theme music is Developers by Corey Smith, who goes by Smix. You can hear the entire song on talkpython.fm. This is your host, Michael Kennedy. Thank you so much for listening. Smix, take us out of here.
Stating with my voice, there's no norm that I can feel within. Haven't been sleeping, I've been using lots of rest. I'll pass the mic back to who rocked it.